It began as an ordinary afternoon in a small, crowded cafe, the kind of place where people came to escape noise, not create it. Near the window, a man sat alone with a simple lunch tray. No entourage, no attention, just a quiet moment carved out of a busy day. He unwrapped his sandwich slowly, eyes lowered, completely unbothered by the world around him. A few tables away, 5 teenagers burst in laughing. Their energy filled the room instantly. Chairs scraping, voices loud, jokes overlapping. They weren't trying to be rude. They were just young, restless, and eager to impress one another. One of them noticed the quiet man by the window. "Yo, check this guy," he whispered, smirking. Another leaned closer. "Looks like he's guarding that sandwich with his life." Laughter followed. One teen casually bumped the table as he passed. The tray shifted slightly. Nothing spilled, but the message was clear. The man looked up, not startled, not angry, just aware. He met their eyes for a brief second, then calmly adjusted his tray and continued eating as if nothing had happened. That reaction confused them. No reaction meant no payoff. So one of them pushed further. "Hey, sir," he said, trying to sound playful. "That lunch any good? Or is it too boring?" A few snickers echoed behind him. The cafe went a little quieter. Not silent, just alert. People noticed. Not because of danger, but because moments like this always carry a choice. The man wiped his hands with a napkin and slowly folded it. He stood up. Not aggressively, not suddenly. Just calmly. For a split second, the teens expected anger. Maybe shouting. Maybe a scene. Instead, they got something far more unsettling. Calm. He looked at them. Not with judgment, but with clarity. And in that moment, something shifted. Because confidence doesn't always raise its voice. And strength doesn't always look threatening. What the 5 teenagers didn't realize was simple. They weren't about to be confronted. They weren't about to be embarrassed. They were about to be taught a lesson they would remember long after the laughter faded. And the cafe, every person in it, was about to witness how real power shows itself without fear, without force, and without a single harsh word. And this was only the beginning. The cafe itself was nothing special, but it had a rhythm of its own. Coffee machines hissed softly behind the counter. Cups clinked. A low hum of conversation filled the air. Students tapping on laptops, workers on short breaks, a couple sharing a quiet moment near the corner. It was the kind of place where everyone coexisted without really noticing one another. The man by the window had chosen that seat on purpose. Not because it was the best view, but because it was calm. He preferred places like this, ordinary, unremarkable, human. He sat with relaxed posture, shoulders slightly forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. His clothes were simple, a worn hoodie, jeans, sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing about him demanded attention, and that was exactly how he liked it. The 5 teenagers, on the other hand, moved like a storm. They had just come from school, backpacks slung over shoulders, laughter spilling out without restraint. They weren't bad kids. They weren't criminals or bullies by nature. They were just caught in that phase where confidence comes from being loud, and approval comes from reactions. They grabbed a table nearby, still laughing about something only they understood. One of them, tall, restless, kept glancing toward the man by the window. "He hasn't looked up once," he muttered. Another shrugged. "Probably doesn't want trouble." The word trouble made them grin, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because they wanted to feel powerful, even if just for a moment. A few minutes passed. The man continued eating slowly, deliberately. He wasn't scrolling on his phone. He wasn't watching them. He was simply present, something rare enough to stand out without trying. That unsettled them more than anger would have. One of the teens reached for a straw dispenser near the man's table, leaning just a bit too close. "Oops," he said lightly, brushing the edge of the table again. This time, a few heads turned. The man paused mid-bite. He placed the sandwich down carefully, as though the moment deserved attention, but not escalation. Across the cafe, an older woman stiffened slightly. The barista slowed their movements. These were the small signals people give when they sense a situation forming. The teens felt it too. That strange pressure when laughter doesn't land the same way. Still, pride pushed them forward. "You eat here a lot?" one of them asked, voice casual but sharp around the edges. The man finally looked up fully. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't threatening. They were steady. "I stop when I'm hungry," he replied evenly. No sarcasm. No edge. The answer landed wrong for them. It wasn't defensive enough. It wasn't submissive enough. It was balanced. And balance is uncomfortable when you're trying to tilt the room in your favor. The teens exchanged glances. For the first time, uncertainty crept in. Not fear, but confusion. This wasn't going how they imagined. They had expected annoyance. Maybe irritation. Something to laugh at later. Instead, they were facing someone who wasn't playing the same game. The man reached for his drink, took a calm sip, then gently slid his tray aside. Not to leave, but to stand. And as his chair moved back quietly against the floor, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Not because violence was coming, but because something meaningful was about to unfold. Not a confrontation. A moment. One that would reveal far more about strength than any loud reaction ever could. And this was where the real lesson began. The chair slid back with a soft scrape. Not loud, not aggressive, but enough to change the air in the room. The man stood slowly, giving himself space, not invading theirs. His hands were visible, relaxed at his sides. No clenched fists. No sharp movements. Just control. The teenagers went quiet. Not because they were afraid, at least not yet, but because uncertainty had replaced excitement. One of them laughed, a little too loudly. "Relax, man. We're just messing around." The words sounded casual, but they carried a question underneath them. "Are you going to react?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked at them. Really looked at them. Not as a group, not as a problem, but as individuals. 5 young faces, each wearing a different version of confidence. One cocky, one nervous, one trying to disappear, one feeding off the group, one unsure how to step back without losing face. He spoke calmly. "Do you know why moments like this matter?" he asked. The question caught them off guard. It wasn't what they expected. "What?" one of them replied. "Moments like what?" "Moments where you decide who you're going to be," the man said, "even when no one tells you to decide." The cafe was quiet now. Not silent, but listening. The barista paused mid-motion. A customer near the door stopped scrolling on their phone. People weren't watching for drama anymore. They were watching for meaning. One of the teens crossed his arms, defensive. "So what? You gonna lecture us now?" The man shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm not here to teach. I'm here to choose how I respond." That answer unsettled them more than a threat would have, because threats give you a role to play. Calm takes that away. Another teen scoffed. "You think you're better than us or something?" The man didn't step closer. He didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was. "I don't know you," he said, "so I wouldn't make that comparison." Then he added, gently, "But I do know this. Respect isn't something you demand from people. It's something you practice, especially when it's inconvenient." One of the teens shifted his weight. This wasn't fun anymore. It felt exposed. The man glanced around the cafe, not for support, not for approval, but to acknowledge the shared space. "Everyone here came for a break," he continued. "Some came to work. Some came to rest. All of us came expecting to be treated like we belong." He looked back at them. Belonging isn't loud. It's mutual. The tallest teen opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time, none of them knew what to say. They had prepared jokes, insults, reactions. They had not prepared reflection. One of the quieter teens spoke up, barely above a murmur. "We were just trying to have fun." The man nodded. "I believe you," he said. "Fun doesn't have to cost someone else their peace." That word, peace, hung in the air. The group felt it. They weren't being embarrassed. They weren't being threatened. They weren't being humiliated. They were being seen. And that was far more uncomfortable than any confrontation. The man reached for his tray, not to throw it away, not to storm off, but to move it slightly, reclaiming his space. "I'll sit back down," he said calmly. "You can decide what you do next." No ultimatum, no warning, just choice. And suddenly, the 5 teenagers realized something important. This wasn't a conflict they could win by being louder, because the man standing in front of them wasn't trying to win at all. And that realization changed everything. The man lowered himself back into the chair with the same calm he'd stood up with. No triumph. No tension released dramatically. Just calm returning to its place. The cafe exhaled. Not all at once, subtly. Chairs creaked again. A cup clinked against a saucer. The hum of the espresso machine resumed. Life continued. But something had changed beneath the surface. The 5 teenagers didn't sit. They stood there for a moment longer than they meant to. Caught between momentum and retreat. The energy they'd brought in, the noise, the bravado, no longer had anywhere to land. One of them glanced around and finally noticed the eyes on them. Not judgmental, not angry, observant. An older man near the counter raised an eyebrow, then returned to his paper. A woman by the window met one teen's eyes briefly, then looked away. Not dismissive, just aware. The barista resumed wiping the counter, but slower now, attentive. It wasn't a crowd demanding consequences. It was a community silently acknowledging a moment of choice. That was new. The tallest teen cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with how loud it sounded in the quiet. So whatever, he muttered, forcing a shrug that didn't quite convince anyone. Another teen nudged his backpack strap higher on his shoulder. Let's just sit, he said, softer than before. They moved back to their table. Not retreating in defeat, retreating in thought. For the first time since they'd entered, they weren't performing. They sat down, chair scraping a little too loudly, then went quiet again. One of them leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at the wood grain like it might offer answers. Man, he whispered, that was weird. Yeah, another replied. He didn't even get mad. That was the problem. Anger would have justified their behavior. Anger would have turned it into a story they could laugh about later. Calm didn't give them that. Across the room, the man finished adjusting his tray and took another bite of his sandwich. Unrushed, unbothered, but not unaware. He wasn't pretending the moment hadn't happened. He had simply allowed it to pass, without dragging it further than it needed to go. The cafe manager, who had been watching from near the counter, stepped a little closer, not to the teens, but to the man. Everything okay here? She asked quietly. He looked up and nodded. All good, he said. Thank you for checking. No complaint. No accusation. The manager nodded back and returned to her station, but the exchange wasn't lost on the teenagers. One of them frowned. He didn't even snitch, he said under his breath. Another shook his head. He didn't need to. That sentence lingered longer than they expected. Minutes passed. The cafe returned fully to its rhythm, but the teens didn't. They poked at their snacks without appetite. The jokes didn't come back. Phones stayed in pockets. Each of them replayed the interaction differently in their own head. One realized he'd been louder than necessary. Another thought about how quickly he'd followed along without thinking. One wondered what he would have done if he'd been alone. Eventually, the quietest teen, the one who had spoken up earlier, stood. I'm going to get a drink, he said. He walked toward the counter, passing close to the man's table. He slowed, not because he was told to, because something inside him insisted. He stopped beside the table, hesitated, then spoke. Hey, he said, voice unsure but sincere. Sorry about earlier. The man looked up. No surprise, no expectation. He studied the teen's face for a moment, then nodded. Thank you for saying that, he replied simply. Nothing more. No lecture. No added weight. The teen swallowed, nodded back, and continued to the counter. When he returned to the table, the others stared at him. What did he say? One whispered. He just said thanks, the teen replied. That's it. Another shook his head slowly. That's kinda worse. What do you mean? Someone asked. It means he wasn't trying to win, the teen said. He was just being real. Silence followed. Across the room, the man finished his lunch. He gathered his trash neatly, stood, and pushed in his chair. As he walked past their table on the way out, he paused. Not dramatically, just briefly. He looked at them, calm as ever. Take care of each other, he said. That's how you take care of yourselves. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. The teens didn't speak for a long time after that. They weren't terrified. They weren't ashamed. They were changed, quietly, deeply, in a way that didn't announce itself, but would surface later when it mattered most. And the cafe returned to normal. carrying with it a lesson that hadn't been forced, hadn't been shouted, but would not be forgotten. The cafe door closed behind the man with a soft chime. For a few seconds, no one moved. It wasn't the dramatic kind of silence that follows a confrontation. It was quieter than that, reflective, like the room itself was replaying what had just happened, frame by frame, trying to understand why it felt different from every other tense moment people usually forget. The 5 teenagers sat still. The tallest one leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the door as if the man might come back. "He didn't even tell us his name," he muttered. "No," another replied, "but somehow it feels like he knows ours." They laughed lightly, but the laugh didn't stick. A few tables away, the older woman who had been watching earlier sipped her coffee and spoke quietly to her companion. "That," she said, "is what self-control looks like." The words weren't meant for the teens, but they heard them anyway. The cafe manager returned to the counter and glanced at the teens once more, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. She had seen countless situations escalate here over the years. Raised voices, hurt pride, arguments that ended with someone storming out. This one hadn't, and that bothered the usual narrative. The quiet teen, the one who had apologized, shifted in his seat. "Do you think he was, famous or something?" "Why?" someone asked. "I don't know," he said. "He just carried himself like someone who doesn't need to prove anything." That idea sat heavily on the table. Minutes later, the barista leaned over to the manager and whispered something. The manager nodded, then looked toward the teens again, thoughtful. She stepped away from the counter and approached their table slowly. "Hey," she said gently, "everything all right now?" They nodded almost in unison. "Yeah," one said. "We're good." She hesitated, then smiled slightly. "You know," she added, "that man comes in here sometimes. Always quiet, always respectful." The teens leaned in without realizing it. "He volunteers at the community center down the street," she continued. "Mentors kids, helps with food drives, never talks about it." The tallest teen frowned. So he wasn't mad. The manager shook her head. "No, but he noticed." That distinction landed hard. Not mad, but aware. She gestured lightly toward the door he'd exited through. "People like that don't correct you to feel powerful," she said. "They correct you so you don't have to learn the hard way later." Then she walked back to the counter. The group sat in silence. One teen rubbed his palms together. "Man, I thought we were just messing around." "We were," another said, "but we didn't think about who else was in the room." The quiet teen nodded. "He didn't make us look stupid. We did that ourselves." That was the reveal. Not that the man was important, not that he had status or influence, but that importance had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with presence. The cafe door opened again as new customers entered, laughter and cold air rushing in. Life moved forward, but for the 5 teenagers, time slowed. One of them pulled out his phone, not to scroll, but to text. "Sorry about earlier. I'll explain later." Another stared at his reflection in the dark screen, noticing for the first time how young he looked when he wasn't pretending to be tough. The tallest teen finally exhaled. "You know what's messed up?" "What?" someone asked. "He could have shut us down in front of everyone," he said. "And I almost wish he had. At least then we'd have an excuse." No one argued, because excuses were easy. Responsibility wasn't. Across the cafe, the manager watched them quietly. She didn't intervene. She didn't lecture. She didn't need to. The lesson had already taken root. When the teens finally stood to leave, they did so differently than they had entered. Backpacks adjusted, voices lower, movements less performative. At the door, one of them paused and looked back at the cafe, not searching for approval, not looking for witnesses, just taking a moment to remember. Outside, the street buzzed with noise, cars, voices, life continuing at full volume. The world hadn't changed, but 5 people had. Not because someone scared them, not because someone shamed them, but because someone showed them that real authority doesn't need to announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful reveal isn't who someone is. It's who you realize you need to become. The lesson was complete. The sun was beginning to dip as the 5 teenagers stepped out of the cafe. The door closed behind them, and the familiar sounds of the street rushed in. Cars passing, distant voices, the rhythm of the city moving forward as it always did. Nothing about the world outside looked different, but they were. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, none of them quite ready to leave. The tallest teen broke the silence first. That was not how I thought today would go. A few quiet chuckles followed, but they faded quickly. Yeah, another said. I thought he'd yell, or at least complain. The quiet teen shook his head. That's the thing. He didn't need to. They started walking together, not in a rush. Their steps fell into an uneven rhythm, backpacks bumping lightly against their shoulders. What got me, one of them said after a moment, was how he just let us choose. Choose what? Someone asked. How we were going to act, he replied. He didn't corner us. That idea lingered. Usually, adults told them what not to do. Rarely did anyone show them how to decide for themselves. They reached the corner, where they would normally split up. But no one turned yet. The tallest teen sighed. I've been thinking, he said. If that was my little brother sitting there, I wouldn't have liked how he acted. No one laughed this time. That's exactly it, another said quietly. We didn't think about who else was watching. The quiet teen nodded. He said something about belonging. That stuck. They stood there, the traffic light changing from red to green, without any of them noticing. Belonging. Not dominating a space. Not claiming it with noise. Sharing it. One of them adjusted his backpack. You think he'd remember us? The quiet teen shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. I don't think that was the point. They crossed the street together. A group of younger kids passed by, laughing loudly, bumping into one another. One of the teens instinctively tensed, then relaxed. Hey, he said, gently moving to give them space. Watch it. The words weren't sharp. They were aware. The kids moved on, oblivious, but something had shifted. That was new. Someone muttered. They walked another block before the tallest teen stopped again. I'm serious, he said. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Which guy? One asked. The one who needs attention to feel important. No one teased him, because they all recognized that feeling. The quiet teen smiled faintly. He didn't embarrass us, he said, so we don't need to defend ourselves. That realization felt like relief. They talked about school, about teachers they respected and ones they didn't, about moments when someone had treated them fairly, and how rare that felt. For once, the conversation wasn't about winning or proving anything. It was about becoming. As they reached the bus stop, the tallest teen pulled out his phone again, not to scroll, not to distract himself. He opened a note. What are you doing? Someone asked. Writing something down, he said, so I don't forget. Forget what? He looked up. How that felt. The bus arrived with a hiss of air and the clatter of doors opening. They climbed aboard one by one, finding seats together. As the bus pulled away, the city rolled past the windows in a blur of storefronts and streetlights. The quiet teen leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. You know, he said. Real strength didn't feel loud at all. The tallest teen nodded. Yeah, it felt steady. They rode in silence after that, not awkward, not heavy, just thoughtful. Back at the cafe, the manager wiped down the table by the window, finding nothing out of place. Just a clean surface, a few crumbs, and a sense that something important had passed through without leaving a mess. That was the resolution. No punishment, no spectacle, no winners or losers, just growth. And sometimes that's the most powerful ending of all. Days later, the cafe was busy again. New faces, new conversations, the same soft hum of ordinary life, continuing exactly as it always had. To most people, nothing had changed. But for the 5 teenagers, the moment lived on quietly, surfacing in unexpected ways. One of them caught himself lowering his voice in a crowded hallway at school. Another stepped aside on a bus without being asked. Small decisions, barely noticeable, but intentional. They didn't talk about the cafe much. They didn't need to. The lesson wasn't dramatic enough to retell loudly. It wasn't a story about fear or embarrassment. It was a story about awareness, and awareness tends to work silently. The quiet teen found himself thinking about one sentence more than the others. Belonging isn't loud. It's mutual. He wrote it on a scrap of paper and taped it inside his locker, not as a reminder of guilt, but of direction. The tallest teen noticed something else had changed. When he stopped trying to dominate the room, people listened more. When he didn't interrupt, conversations lasted longer. When he chose respect, it came back to him, unexpected and unforced. That surprised him most of all. Back at the cafe, the staff carried on as usual. The manager greeted customers. The baristas moved with practiced ease. No one spoke about the incident. They didn't have to. Moments like that don't announce themselves. They settle. And somewhere else in the city, the man who had quietly eaten his lunch went on with his life as well. He didn't think of himself as someone who had taught a lesson. He simply believed in leaving places better than he found them, even if that improvement was invisible. That belief mattered, because not every lesson needs a stage. Not every correction needs an audience. Sometimes the most lasting influence comes from refusing to escalate and choosing instead to model the behavior you hope to see. The teenagers carried that forward. Not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. Weeks later, one of them overheard a younger student being mocked at school. The laughter sounded familiar, uncomfortable. He hesitated for half a second, then spoke up. "Hey," he said calmly, "that's not necessary." No shouting, no confrontation, just presence. The laughter faded. The moment passed. And for the first time, he understood what that man in the cafe had done. He hadn't tried to control the situation. He had trusted others to rise. That was the moral. Respect isn't about fear. Strength isn't about volume. Leadership isn't about winning. It's about consistency, especially when no one is forcing you to care. We all enter shared spaces every day. Cafes, classrooms, offices, streets. Each one offers the same quiet question. Who are you going to be here? The answer doesn't need applause. It just needs intention. If this story resonated with you, carry it forward, not by repeating it, but by living it. Because kindness practiced in small moments has a way of echoing far beyond where it began.